is this report on climate emergency and the future of civic space. It's about drawing lessons from the war on terror, but Iago will explain it all to you. So I think what the question that he wants to address is there a danger of securitizing the climate change, the climate emergency, and what that means he's going to explain to you. So what we'll do today is we'll hear from him and Marika, who are the authors of the report, and we'll also hear from, but before that, we will also hear from the UN Special Rapporteur on Environmental Defenders, Michel Forst, and he was supposed to be here in person, but alas couldn't make it. So this is a hybrid event, so welcome to all the people who are online. I hope they can hear and see everything, and you're very welcome to put things in the chat, and somebody or other will tell me what's in the chat. So let's just start, and I will introduce everybody as they go along. So let's just start with the message from Michel Forst. And maybe those of us who would like to watch it can walk over there. Watch it. You don't have to. Oh, but I would like to watch it.
Good evening, everyone. I was not able to join you live today. However, I wanted to share a few thoughts drawing from my experience as the UN Special Rapporteur on Environmental Defenders since I was elected in June 2022. And I know it's not the core topic of today, and it may not be addressed directly by other speakers, but I would like to start with a brief definition. A brief definition that will be necessary to understand the perspective from which I'm speaking today. For me, for the UN, an environmental defender is anyone who seeks to promote or to protect the human rights to live in a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment. It can be individuals, it can be groups, or organizations. And self-identifying as an environmental defender is not for me a prerequisite. In fact, what we see is that many environmental defenders become simply defenders out of a necessity and do not identify as such. But regardless, they are all protected under international human rights law and the Aarhus Convention. Standing up for the environment often involves speaking up against powerful political and economic interests. And this partly explains why today, throughout the world, environmental defenders are the human rights defenders that are the most at risk of being attacked and even being killed. This is the sad reality, well documented by different NGOs, such as Global Witness, that last reported at least 1,500 killings of defenders since the adoption of the Paris Agreement in 2015. Of course, the threats and attacks and killings that defenders face may vary from countries to countries. However, in my role as the UN rapporteur and through my meetings with defenders in the last 2.5 years, I was able to observe some shared trends of repression. The restriction of civic space through increasing restrictions on the right to freedom of expression, protest and association is one of these trends. And in February last year, I published a position paper of the mandate that argued that the current state repression of environmental protest and civil disobedience is a major threat to human rights, a major threat to democracy. This assessment came from my many observations I made during my visits to different countries and highlighted that this repression spanned at least 4 dimensions. Firstly, a portrayal of environmental defenders as criminals in public discourse, including public officials, including the media. Secondly, legislations and policy changes aimed at restricting the exercise of fundamental freedoms, and particularly the right to protest. Thirdly, law enforcement that was in many ways abusive and contributed to a significant chilling effect for the exercise of these rights, including through the use of counter-terrorism or national security measures. And finally, in the court's approach, that sometimes contribute to further repress or to criminalize environmental defenders through, for instance, the misuse of pretrial detention, harsh bail conditions, or disproportionate sentences. And as I know that pre-recorded video messages can quickly become tedious, I will only stop on the first point, the portrayal of defenders as criminals in the public discourse, which I think gives roots to how repression then unfolds in the other dimensions. It has become quite common to see the portrayal of environmental defenders, including climate activists, as criminals. For instance, with politicians who describe their mobilizations as ecotourism, and with the media that then spread such inflammatory language. And this trend is for me extremely concerning because it clearly sets the ground for the repression of environmental defenders. Yes, because they are portrayed as criminals, then they are treated as such. Because they are portrayed as terrorists, then they are treated as such. This means that laws meant to deal with terrorism, with all the exceptional measures it entails, with all the removal of safeguards meant to guarantee the protection of rights in a democratic society, are used and misused against them. I have seen environmental defenders and protesters being sent to prison simply for planning the organization of a disruptive yet peaceful protest. I have seen environmental defenders with bail conditions included very strict curfew, electric tax, and bans on seeing other members of the same organization or even to take part in any climate change protest. Interestingly, when reading the report that you are launching today, I did realize that this observation finds an echo in the securitization theory described in the report. Someone is framed as an existential threat so that the public accepts the need to extraordinary measures, to then allow the authorities to adopt extraordinary measures. Worryingly, in that case, what is framed as an existential threat are environmental defenders and environmental protesters. The repression that takes place to respond to the so-called threats that defenders would pose to society do not only affect environmental defenders targeted by these measures. It also unfolds in different indirect ways because it has a long-term impact on everyone's rights through restriction of civil space, and because also it has a sort of chilling effect on everyone as well. People are scared to exercise their fundamental rights, for instance to protest when they know that this can result in being arrested or having their data recorded on a sort of surveillance file. In my different meetings with defenders, I'm often asked, why is it that litigation against projects harmful to the environment is taking so long, whereas environmental defenders prosecuted for holding protests against the same project are so quickly tried and convicted? Or why are environmental defenders supposed to do if protesting against the company that operates the project that possibly amounts to environmental crimes leads them to prison until the courts indeed acknowledge that the project was illegal in the first place? Replying to this question is difficult, of course, and yet this is a major issue that indeed needs to be addressed both in the future of civic space and for decision-making aimed at addressing the triple planetary crisis of climate change, biodiversity loss, and pollution. I really hope that this report launched today will contribute to guide these reflections. Thank you very much.
we can't really clap because he's not here. Well, it's a pity he's not here because that was great and it really tells us why the report is so important. And so with that, I will ask Yavor to introduce the report.
Thank you very much.
And I should say Yavor is a research fellow. I forgot to introduce you, Yavor, in our Conflict and Civicness research group.
Thank you very much, Mary. I can't thank the special rapporteur, as you said, because unfortunately he couldn't join live. But thank you also for everyone who's joining us for the launch of this report. And as Mary said, the report and the project behind it are really about thinking about the risks of securitizing the climate crisis, specifically for human rights and civic space, but also more broadly. And an argument that we make in the report is that there is a real risk that, in a way, securitization in the climate area may act in similar ways in which securitization in other areas has worked, in counterterrorism, in drugs, migration, where instead of dealing with the underlying issue, sort of tackling the drivers, the causes of the underlying problem, it becomes a substitute and sort of deals with some of the symptoms in very problematic ways, particularly for civic space and human rights. So in a way, the report responds to two trends that we've observed in the past 20 years, and our conviction that, first of all, these trends need to be thought of together, that we need to think about them jointly, but also that there is now, in relation to this particular risk, the risk of securitizing the climate crisis, there is a real window of opportunity, that we are early in the pathway and we don't have to experience what we did experience with the war on terror, which is always reactive. Waves of human rights violations, abuses of power, exceptionalism that sort of challenges fundamental norms. And only sort of the ability to react and respond to that after the fact in ways that have been quite ineffective, actually, in addressing the negative impacts of these approaches. So the two trends that we respond to, one is this growing trend of securitizing climate change. And it's coming in very different forms, and it is driven by very different range of actors for very different purposes. We're seeing a proliferation of climate emergency declarations in discourse globally. We are also seeing increasingly sort of alarming calls by both climate scientists and climate activists about the existential threat that climate change is posing to humanity and life on Earth. We are also seeing a growing number of governments, militaries, and corporate actors using the language of climate security and connecting to that agenda for their own purposes. And also we are seeing, I think, in democracies, an ongoing debate about whether or not democracy can be an answer. Can provide an answer to a threat as existential and complex as climate change, and sort of arguments that are coming even from some well-meaning environmentalists about the idea that we may need to suspend democracy for a while, and that we may need some kind of eco-authoritarianism in order to implement the kind of transformative action that is required in order to address climate change. And in fact, the election of Donald Trump and the sort of the pullout from the Paris Accord has triggered, paradoxically, some of these arguments to be made again. That, here we are, this is what democracy gives us, a set of inadequate and counterproductive sort of tools to respond to the climate crisis. The other phenomenon that we've been concerned at the Conflict and Civicness study group for a very, very long time, and it emerged out of early work on global civil society, is the trend of closing civic space. It has been well researched and established for a number of years, but particularly in the past decade, what the evidence is showing is that one of the key drivers behind the closing civic space phenomenon, this sort of crackdown, restriction, persecution of civil society activists and other civic actors, that one of the key drivers has been securitization, particularly the rise of global counterterrorism norms and practices and their downstream effects, but also the way that agenda and that discourse has been used, as Michelle Force pointed out, also to attack now environmental activists. So if you want, what we are seeing is a repurposing and redeploying of a set of counterterrorism norms and practices now applied also to environmental protesters and climate activists. So as I said, we felt it was important to think about these two trends together and to try and think, first, what does climate securitization mean? What it may mean in the future, and with that sort of forward-looking approach, looking into the future also of civic space and human rights. And I think the report has two sort of interconnected objectives. One is to raise awareness about these risks, the risks of securitization, not only for civic space and human rights, but more broadly, securitization of the climate crisis, but also to really emphasize this point that we are early in that pathway and that there are opportunities to push back, to subvert, to innovate in ways that may shift the pathway and open up alternatives. So I will mention just a couple of things from the report, and other panelists will address a number of issues we tackle there. But in thinking about the future and how we think about securitization going forward, we take our clues from some of Mary's work, which really shows that securitization can mean different things depending on the meaning of security. So one meaning of security and one purpose for securitization is really about making an issue very important. It's about elevating the importance of an issue and also about making sure that sufficient attention and resources are directed to address that issue. And this is what a lot of climate activists and climate scientists are doing, including by using some of the discourse around emergency, but also some of the climate security frames. They're trying to really emphasize the issue and make sure that it gets the attention and resources that it needs. And we call this the prioritization narrative to securitizing, the prioritization pathway to securitizing climate change. Another meaning of security is about the security apparatus. It is about taking an issue and bringing it under the purview of the military, the police, and the intelligence agencies. And this sort of is often what we see when, rather than tackling the underlying issue, the underlying drivers of the problem, the causes, what effectively happens is a sort of a militarized response that addresses some of the consequences in, again, very problematic and counterproductive often ways that may backfire. And we've seen this in the war on terror with a number of the instruments, militarized approaches, and tools that were used, not only not solving the problem of terrorism, but in many ways also feeding it and making it worse. So this is the militarization pathway. And then the final one we call authoritarianization. And really scholars of securitization within academia is what they mean by securitization is this. It is effectively about creating a state of exception. It is about arguing that something is such a serious and existential threat that it justifies extraordinary responses that break with normal rules and procedures, exceptional measures that violate human rights and civil liberties. And so, in a way, the authoritarianization pathway is about that. It is about, if you want, exercising and consolidating executive power, free of moral, legal, and political constraints. So this is the authoritarianization pathway that we chart, and what we do in the report is to try to map the logic of each pathway, the actors and the drivers behind it, now and potentially in the future, but also to assess the implications of each for civic space. As you can imagine, the militarization and authoritarianization pathways are the most problematic, the most dangerous for civil society and human rights. But we argue that the prioritization pathway also carries its own risks, because there is a risk that well-intentioned efforts by pro-climate actors who are using the prioritization who are using the securitization language, who are using the language of emergency and exceptionalism in arguing for climate action, may end up being subverted and co-opted by those other two, by actors whose political and economic interests are served either by militarization or authoritarian responses, or in some cases, both. So I will not be able to go through what is really the heart or the bulk of the report, where we identify 6 lessons from the war on terror, which are really, if you want, the mechanisms, how securitization occurs, what are the inflection points when these dynamics get sort of embedded in norms, in laws, in policies, in institutions, and therefore become very difficult to roll back. But I will just name them without discussing them. So we look at constituencies for securitization, and we sort of draw implications from those lessons for migration, which I think Nathan will talk about. Another lesson is about threat framing. Those who remember the sort of the immediate response to 9/11 will remember that there was a brief moment when the meaning was unsettled, and then very quickly the Bush administration imposed the meaning on it. And the meaning was that this was a foreign attack on the United States. And so in a way, what we are arguing is it's not just that something is framed as an existential threat. It also matters how exactly that underlying threat is framed and is interpreted. So because of the way in which 9/11 were interpreted, that opened up space, that justified a set of responses which were effectively warfighting and mass surveillance. And at the same time, it shut down an alternative argument, which some made at the time, that 9/11 should be interpreted as crime against humanity, and that the response to that crime against humanity should be justice in law enforcement, how we had traditionally dealt with terrorism domestically prior to 9/11. So we apply this lesson to climate security, and we sort of identify different interpretations within the climate security discourse, which are at the moment struggling or competing with each other. The meaning of climate security is unsettled, and even within the same government, the military and military ministry will interpret it very much in terms of national security. And what that frame does is it converts the ecological threat into a human threat, the threat of conflict and refugees and migrants who are fleeing climate change impacts as a threat multiplier, versus other ministries within the same government often, and other actors who understand climate security very much in terms of human security, the security of individuals and communities, and in terms of environmental security. So there is a real struggle at the moment over defining the meaning of climate security, and that is part of the opportunity, I think, for action. Another lesson is about the role of the UN Security Council. I think what we uncover and what also FIX and other groups' research has shown is that bringing counterterrorism under Chapter 7 of the UN Security Council for maintenance of international peace and security was a huge inflection point in the pathways of the war on terror, in the securitization pathways. It provided, in a way, both sort of incentives for states to draw on these norms and sort of show that they're complying and are reliable partners in the war on terror, but also it created opportunities for them to abuse those norms. And that had particularly problematic impact on civic space and civil society. And we asked the question, what does it mean for bring in, as a number of actors and a number of states as well have been pushing for in recent years, what does it mean to bring climate change under Chapter 7 of the Security Council, this particular Security Council, with these particular problems that it has, but also based on our experience of how other issues that are brought under Chapter 7 and are securitized there have been dealt with ultimately. There is a very interesting and sort of often neglected part of the story, which is about informal regulation and soft law. Informal regulation and soft law is, I think, responsible for some of the most opaque pathways in the war on terror and some of the most problematic and harmful impacts on civic space and human rights. This is what happens when norms, counter-terror norms in that case, were set with things like best practices or technical guidelines, often by organizations or networks. They didn't have treaty powers, and the sort of classic example is the Financial Action Task Force and the chilling impact of its recommendation 8, which basically framed NGOs, civil society, and non-state actors as particularly vulnerable to terrorists, to abuse for terrorism and other criminal purposes. And of course, in the environmental field, environmental soft law is hugely important. It is much easier than getting collective state action, as we're now seeing with the US withdrawal from the Paris Accords. It is much faster in responding to needs as they arise. But the flip side of that is the lack of transparency and accountability and the real danger and risk that creates. And we examine this in relation to green sacrifice zones, and particularly areas where the extraction of critical minerals will be hugely important in the next period. I will not talk about our next lesson because Mariko will discuss it in great detail, which is really about climate finance and partnerships. And we looked at this is, if you want, the political economy of securitization, something that our research group has worked on for a very, very long time. And what can that tell us about implications for climate finance and climate partnerships? And then the final one is about desecuritization. So the literature on securitization says that at some point what happens is an issue that is securitized, that is brought into exceptional politics, is desecuritized by bringing it back into normal politics. Now, what we find in the war on terror is that rather than desecuritization, what we've seen is normalization of those very exceptional emergency measures. Whether one talk about technologies that were marginal prior to 9/11, such as drones, but became sort of the default response, or legislation, counterterrorism legislation in places like France, which is initially linked to a state of emergency, which is supposed to be about a short period of time addressing a particular crisis, that ends up being absorbed within normal law and becomes sort of the norm. And I think this relates to the debate about eco-authoritarianism, because this idea that we can suspend democracy for a while, that we can suspend the rule of law and human rights and international law for a while dealing with the climate emergency, and then we can easily go back to it, I think is very problematic in light of our experience with counterterrorism and the war on terror. Now, I do want to end on a positive note, and I think that there is a real opportunity at the moment to think about these issues, to raise awareness and debate and discuss them, and to think about responses. First, because the securitization agenda as it stands is mostly still driven by progressive pro-climate actors. And I think because of that, there is a real opportunity for engagement within civic spaces and within civil society, and try to raise awareness about these risks so that strategies and ways of climate action that these actors pursue are at least aware and sort of sensitive to these potential risks. The other opening is what I mentioned about the unsettled meaning of climate security. This struggle over climate security is happening as we speak between different departments and part of different governments, because for them the different meanings are also about the resources and the importance that their particular department may get. And I think that it is really important to think about what is climate security framed as national security and climate security as human and environmental security. And now is the time to have those discussions and to make sure that we don't take the pathway of national security. And then finally, I will sort of end on really reiterating the main point, which is, while our entry point was very much human rights and civic space, these findings and these arguments, I think, have much broader relevance, particularly for those who are genuinely concerned about the climate crisis and about climate action, because there is a real risk that, as we have seen it in other domains, in other issues that have been securitized, instead of becoming a catalyst for addressing the climate crisis, we can see how very easily it could become a substitute, and it could actually divert attention and resources away from climate mitigation, away from climate justice, and potentially provide the impetus, provide the sort of inflection point, if you want, for militarized and authoritarian responses. So I think our report is both sort of an attempt to raise awareness and trigger debate and discussion, but it is also a call for action. So I'll stop there.
Okay, great. Thank you. Thank you, Yavor. And now we're going to hear about the missing element of his description of the report from Marika Theros. Marika is a policy fellow in our research group. And I should have said that she is also, together with Yavor, co-founder of the Civic Ecosystems Initiative, and she's director of the Civic Engagement Project. So she's a lot of things. Anyway, over to you, Marie.
Thanks, Mary. I'm not going to be describing all the 6 lessons, just to get that clear. I'll be focusing on one of the lessons, on financial flows, and basically on how financial flows and partnership arrangements have created risks in embedding securitizing practices and actors, and how this in turn might fuel militarization, authoritarianism, and the suppression of civic space. So I spent a lot of time working on the war on terror. The majority of my work has really focused on the political economy of security and conflict. And in Afghanistan, we very much found that the security assistance is what really helped facilitate elite capture and militarized responses, especially because it also redirected state-building efforts and development aid towards counterterrorism priorities. And it was this approach that really fostered sort of corruption, shielded elites in the government from accountability, and we've all saw what the consequences of that were several years back.
Today Can everybody hear you? Yeah, okay.
Okay, I'll try to speak louder. Today we
Maybe
also...
closer to the... That's fine.
Yeah, that's fine.
Yeah.
Today we also see similar risks, some of the similar risks in climate finance. Billions of dollars are flowing towards climate mitigation and adaptation. And the real concern here is that these large influxes of climate finance, rather than promote climate action, actually could unintentionally act as a new form of rent, captured by elites, closing civic space, and fueling militarization or authoritarianism. In our report, you'll see that we identified about 3 key mechanisms through which finance and partnership arrangements embed securitization and facilitate these sort of negative pathways. And these mechanisms, which we draw on from lessons on the war on terror financing, really helps us understand how finance and partnerships shape governance, human rights, and civic space. So the first mechanism is how security finance and the war on terror really reshaped the agendas and the priorities of other developing countries, but as well as a number of institutions domestically. Many developing countries were incentivized to join the war on terror, and this sort of led to a shift away from the development and governance agenda. In Afghanistan, the logic really encouraged political elites to link security to state building and economic development and to counterterrorism priorities. So instead of focusing on building governance, it fostered corruption and repression. Domestically, in the United States, we saw how this was mirrored when the US created Homeland Security and also started having a huge influx of Homeland Security spending post-2001. And it helped really inflate sort of perceived terrorist threats. As Homeland spending increased, especially in the early years, the list of potential targets that congressmen put to Homeland Security rose from a simple 160 to 300,000 in 3 years in the US in order to attract state funding and also to attract other forms of funding and so forth. A second mechanism involves the opaque and really untransparent ways in which security finance had flowed. There was, in 2017, there was a nonpartisan study group at the Stimson Center, and it found that war on terror spending was really difficult to track because most of it was off budget. It was part of discretionary and emergency related spending, which is what helped fuel corruption. Third, security finance was also very much leveraged not only to forge partnerships with government actors and corrupt officials, but also with strongmen and local power brokers, with really little regard for their human rights record or impact on civic space. These partnerships ended up generating more insecurity, which provided further justification for more financing to the very same actors generating insecurity. A serious consequence, really, as well as part of this, was that there was a sort of a deepening merger between public and private elites. And many of these elites were linked to new businesses, and they used their power to sort of suppress dissent, consolidate control, and close civic space under the guise of fighting terrorism, especially as international security-related assistance was by far higher than other sources of development aid or revenue for many fragile and developing countries. In our report, we suggest that climate finance and climate diplomacy may create some similar risks. Today, foreign assistance and development financing is actually shrinking, while climate finance and diplomacy are ballooning. In some cases, the World Bank climate finance has become has really risen, and even some suggest, even though it's hard to identify the numbers, overtaken funds for governance initiatives and support. Much of the debate, of course, on climate finance is rightly centered on issues of scale and equity. There have been lesser but growing discussions on sort of the relationship between climate finance and corruption, but these are much more framed in terms of their effects on climate effectiveness, the effectiveness of climate interventions, rather than their impacts on the broader political governance and human rights situation. And in many ways, climate finance is very similar and characteristic to war on terror financing. It's very opaque. The UN has described the global finance architecture as, quote, complex and fragmented. And despite the emergence of dedicated climate funds, the majority of climate finance still flows through non-climate specific ODA channels, but that are outside of more well-controlled channels. In addition, climate finance tends to go to the highest risk sectors, such as energy, transport, and infrastructure, that are particularly prone to corruption. And these sectors also, I think another challenge is that many of these sectors increasingly rely on private finance and blended models, which introduce sort of risks for regulatory capture and financial opacity. Often, often governments structure public-private partnerships. Public-private partnerships are very much used in a lot of these types of projects, but they're structured often in ways that allow politically connected private sector actors to extract financial benefits without scrutiny. And there have been a number of examples of these cases, both that have used multilateral funds, UNDP funds. There's been corruption cases, including bribing authorities for illegal logging in Indonesia and UN projects, or I'm sure others have heard of the Odebrecht scandal in Brazil. The highest risk countries for climate change, of course, also tend to be the ones with the highest rates of corruption and repression, which creates a lot of challenges for climate diplomacy, where, of course, cooperation and partnership is needed. A challenge, though, is that global climate diplomacy really prioritizes financial commitments, emissions reductions, and technical solutions, but doesn't really take into consideration governance and accountability. As a result, a number of high-risk countries may receive billions in climate funding while actively also repressing environmental activists and silencing civil society. People talked recently, accused Azerbaijan, who is the host of COP29, of using climate diplomacy to boost their international legitimacy, while at the same time repressing civil society and committing abuses. But another more clear example may be the case of the Vietnam 4 in Vietnam's Just Energy Transition Partnership, and how this partnership helped to, it was weaponized against civil society. So just by way of background, the Vietnam 4, for those who don't know, are among the country's leading environmentalist advocates. And as Michelle Forst had discussed before, more broadly about environmental defenders, they were deeply engaged in the country's climate plans. They helped shape the energy transition policies. They were key in devising in the plans that helped secure the Just Energy Transition Partnership, which brought in $15.5 billion to support Vietnam's clean energy transition. But soon after the funds were secured, they were arrested on dubious tax evasion charges. So while the Vietnamese welcomed climate finance, they criminalized the very actors responsible who had helped develop the plan. And in many ways, we see how this could potentially mirror how security finance was used in the war on terror, where partners accepted this while repressing opposition. But of course, I think Yabor had mentioned it earlier, this also exposes sort of a broader paradox. Civil society has played a very critical role in shaping climate policies and plans and in shaping climate action. But as international financing grows, these actors are becoming increasingly marginalized and repressed. This creates risks not only for civic space, but also it creates significant risks for the effectiveness of climate change projects. But ultimately, the broader risk is that many governments may view climate finance as an economic and political resource, as a rent, rather than a tool to fight climate change, and in the process reinforce patronage and corruption, marginalize civil society, and potentially bankroll authoritarianism. Of course, as Yabor mentioned, today we're in a new environment. Trump's return to power signals a rise in exceptionalism and securitization more broadly, even if he denies climate change and pulls out of the Paris Agreement. He has already declared 2 emergencies, one on energy and one on the southern border. So I think what we're likely to see is more increased militarization to the inevitably intensifying impacts of climate change, whether it's increased focus on climate-induced migration as a national security threat, more militarized border enforcement, or expanding the surveillance and policing of environmental activists and protests. Thanks.
So thank you. So now we have a couple of people who are going to respond a little bit to the report, and one is Poonam Joshi, who's director of the Funders Initiative for Civil Society, which has been supporting research. And previously she was executive director of the Civicness Trust, and also director of the European Office for the Fund for Global Human Rights. So Poonam, you're very welcome to sit here or stand up, whichever you prefer.
I think I'll go there.
Okay.
Yes,
great.
thank you. Good evening, everyone. I just first really wanted to thank LSE for being interested in pursuing this line of inquiry. And also wanted to thank the Fund for Global Human Rights, who worked very closely with us and London School of Economics in really sort of following the journey the research team have been on. I'm going to pull out 3 observations, reflections about the phenomena and what's in the report, but I wanted to start with explaining why Funders Initiative for Civil Society was interested in this issue. So we're a philanthropic initiative. We seek to mobilise philanthropy to direct resources to interventions that will tackle repression against civil society and strengthen democracy. And in 2019, we carried out a global review to try and anticipate and understand the trends that would shape the future of civic space, particularly in an era of crises. And at that point, we didn't know the pandemic was around the corner. But the ones we were seeing, you know, climate, tech converging with populism, culture wars, hyper inequality. Through that research, we identified 3 cross-cutting drivers, and the first 2 did not come as a surprise. One was threats to democracy from anti-rights actors, and then secondly was essentially neoliberalism, but the expansion and abuse of economic power. The one that we had an aha moment, and it actually came up, I remember a conversation with Finola Nyolan, who was the former UN Special Rapporteur on counterterrorism and human rights. And we knew there was some link between securitization and restrictions, but I think it was the conversation with her where she said, this is going to be the mothership of authoritarianism, and started talking about this repurposing and abuse of emergency powers. And then we started talking about the climate crisis, and she was like, this is it. I think this is going to be the toolbox that governments use to put a lid on the discontent and people frightened about the responses at the kind of unfolding of the climate crisis. And so we were very interested also in this driver because we could see there were a diversity of restrictions on civil society that could be traced back to this, and I'll talk about that more in a moment. But as Professor Nyolan had said, we also anticipated that this was likely to become the default response by states to crisis and therefore the mothership of authoritarian or rise of authoritarianism. So we supported this report to help anticipate future threats and opportunities. A lot of us who in the room have worked on civic space for many years were just on the back foot and constantly taken by surprise. So this was a piece of research to go, what happens if we look ahead and anticipate scenarios? And is there an opportunity for civil society that then influence instead of just react? So the 3 points I wanted to make, I think the first is that we're in quite unique moments in terms of the nature of threats and risks that humanity is facing, and then the nature of the scale when we frame those risks as an emergency. So, I mean, political repression isn't a new phenomenon. Sovereign nation states have long used their monopoly on the ability to decide on a state of exception to declare emergencies, and then use their security apparatus to advance their political or economic interests at home, abroad. So if you think about colonialism or apartheid, these states of exception, which in many cases are supposed to be time limited, inevitably shift laws and norms in ways that weaken rule of law and civil liberties. You never quite go back to where you started once those laws have been brought in. And they can even leave what I think of as a palimpsest of emergency powers to be repurposed in the future. So if you look at India and environmental defenders, they both are targeted using colonial era sedition legislation, but also legislation brought under the War on Terror. In South Africa, the surveillance architecture that was brought in under apartheid remained, and that culture and architecture and infrastructure still remained. However, within that long history of states of exception, the War on Terror, as Yavor and Marika have described, was an inflection point. So it's a moment where you have this simultaneous global proliferation of anti-terror measures, not just in this country or that country, it's everywhere, leading to a global normalization of overuse and abuse of security measures. And that's where you also have the kind of modus operandi of why this project is such a threat to civic space. It's not inevitable that it should be, but what happened in those weeks after 9/11, one of the resolutions passed was 1373 that you mentioned in the report, and this is where the UN calls upon the international community to crack down on terrorism and violent extremism. And it wants them to do several things. Crack down on the ability to transmit information and gain support. It wants to crack down on their ability to organize secretly. It wants to crack down eventually on their ability to cross borders. It wants to crack down on their ability to access money. You look at that, those are the same conditions you need for progressive civil society to thrive as well. And what you have at the heart of this proliferation of laws and measures is also a lack of clear definitions about what constitutes terrorism. So that's the moment at which they can suddenly be used for whoever you characterize as a threat to security. And what you also see at the heart of this project, which you couldn't have done, say, 50 years ago, but because of the evolution of technology, you have these states wanting to kind of completely nullify the risk of terrorism. So you have the justification of preemptive approaches. 50 years ago, you would have had old-fashioned surveillance, but now you have mass surveillance using technology, for example, justified because we have to show public governments that we spotted this before, at its origins. So that's what the war on terror does. The pandemic was another global inflection moment, entirely different type of crisis. The measures were even less likely to actually support public health, but you saw those measures that were introduced in many cases repurposed to crack down, for example, on media and free expression. And then in between those two moments, and since the pandemic, we see states are bringing a range of problems under the rubric of countering terrorism and extremism. Migration, that Nathan will talk about, war on drugs, and Fund for Global Human Rights has done very interesting research in the Philippines on how the war on drugs has led to attacks on civil society. They're also bringing in, states are looking at new forms of domestic terrorism from a range of new actors. So 20 years ago, we were talking about jihadis. Now we could be talking about QAnon. We could be talking about anti-vaxxers. We could be talking about incels. But easily, because of that absence of clear definition, if you're Trump, those are your allies. You're talking about migrants' rights activists. You're talking about environmental activists. The security powers are already there, and the vagueness of the powers are already there to be deployed by governments happy to blur the lines between lawful protest or social unrest or political violence or acts that legally constitute terrorism. And you see Trump, sort of across that continuum will blur lawful protest with terrorism and pardon terrorists as defending national interests. So it all kind of feels inevitable that the climate crisis and the crisis generated by its impact would be another inflection point. And that will have implications not just for democracy, but as the other Marika have explained, implications for effective action on the climate crisis. So the second point I want to look at is, well, how is this phenomena impacting civic space? Yavor and Marika have already talked about some of the broader impacts on democracy, rising authoritarianism, corruption. I'm going to talk specifically about the impact on freedom of expression, assembly, and association. And I'm going to start with the sort of framing. What you generally find is that I think most right-minded people, if you introduced anti-terror legislation to target female driver in Saudi Arabia, would be going, what are you doing? And the reality is that there's a process of storytelling, of framing particular people as threats to society before you can start using the anti-terror legislation against them. I know one of you talked about the roots of, I think it was Michelle Force talked about, the roots of repression are the smear attacks. So the process of securitization requires political and public buy-in, a willingness to give up rights. And this is where how the threat is framed is so pivotal. So you see both authoritarian and populist governments using different justifications to target both communities and activists. So migrants' rights activists are permitting threats to health security, somewhere like Poland, where there's practically no migration, but migrants would be being described as parasites, and the migrants' rights activists are people who are going to allow a health security crisis. You've got activists being deemed to be environmental, labour rights, a threat to economic security. Seen that in India, seen it in the US. Feminist and LGBTI activists pose a threat to morality and traditional values. We've seen that in Russia, Saudi Arabia. And the next wave, I think you are going to see, I think, as Yavor, you mentioned, environmental defenders challenging abuses in the extraction of transition minerals will be kind of viewed as a threat to global environmental security. And across the political mainstream, government and media, you have this sense that, that using security powers is pragmatic and patriotic, and that those of us who call for alternative security models are naive or placing national security at risk. So that's the kind of swamp that you're kind of dealing with, but that sort of then allows governments to use anti-terror legislation with far more muted concern. So we see an increasing use of anti-terror legislation being used to criminalise protest and expression. Frontline defenders have identified it as the most prominent form of attack against activists and the one that's rising the most. And I think there's something particular about being prosecuted under terrorism legislation as opposed to criminal legislation. There's less due process, there's more secrecy, it's far more frightening, it's far more effective in chilling protest. You also have waves of restrictive NGO laws, we can talk more about that. And you also have the technical dimension of mass surveillance, targeted surveillance, content moderation, censorship, right the way to internet shutdowns. And I think, Nathan, you're going to talk more about biometrics and tech and migration in a moment. So that's what it looks like, and that's what we're kind of expecting is going to intensify. And as you can see, it's not just being used against environmental activists, it's a whole range of activists. So the final point that I want to make is that there is a window of opportunity. Now, we particularly work with philanthropy. We've started working with climate philanthropy. Over the last decade, their primary approach was treating the climate crisis as a technical problem, that if you were able to, I don't know, transform industry, transport, aviation, work with governments, it was just a calculation of reducing carbon emissions. And after 20 years, they've started realizing that actually what they're also dealing with is the political problem, and that that democratic deficit is actually impeding efforts to slow global warming. So going back to the kind of premise of this report, so decision makers are only likely to take long overdue action needed if subjected to public pressure, hence the use of the emergency frame. However, several of the things that are preventing the public from mobilizing around this or having impact, corporate power and the fossil fuel lobby that has engaged in disinformation, the securitized attacks on civil society, all of these things are manifestations of a deficit of democracy. So rather than actually what we need is more authoritarianism, we need more democracy. And that's not going to be corrected by emergency powers that further take power away from people. So in this context, and precisely because this is an issue that affects everyone, the climate crisis creates an opportunity to question the dominance and the relevance of the hard security paradigm, and I think offers a concrete entry point to tackle rising authoritarianism. And the final point I'm going to make is, historically, it's been very difficult to challenge that paradigm and also its effectiveness. So under the war on terror, you had the security establishment saying, well, there's the black box here of national security. We can't look, you can't join us to look at what's kind of happening and what works and what doesn't. Pandemic was an interesting moment because you had an opening for public health experts to question the use of security measures to tackle an infectious disease. But it was difficult for them to get much traction. It was a very fast unfolding crisis. Now with the climate crisis, we've got this early opportunity to mobilize a vast ecosystem of actors who should be our allies to push states to genuinely act for environmental protection and public interest instead of for their own vested interests or personal gains. And it's an opportunity to put forward other frames: human security, environmental peace building, climate justice. And for us, we very much hope that this report will be a catalyst for that conversation and more movements coming together around a common threat. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Poon. And I think, you know, I'm somebody who's always talking about human security, so I very much agree with you. We need a different security frame for climate change. So finally, we come to our last speaker, and but last but not least, Nathan Akehurst. He's a writer and campaigner who advises on communications and campaigns, and he's got a book that's coming out on European border policy, and, which I think is wonderful, he volunteers for Civil Sea Rescue.
Can everyone hear me all right? Wonderful. Thank you for that introduction, Mary, and for your prolific corpus of work. And thanks a lot to the Civicness and Conflict Research Group. I hope I've got that acronym right, for holding the space for what has already been a fascinating discussion. And thank you to whoever in the design team is responsible for this slightly terrifying scarlet-robed Extinction Rebellion character staring at me from, I think, 5 directions. Yeah, I think those of us in the climate movement are somewhat tired of hearing the phrase all politics is climate politics, but it very much is, and we are only now starting to unpack what that means. As Mary said, I work on the intersection between climate, security and migration, and it's a very messy intersection, and it's very timely that we're having this discussion this week as Donald Trump takes office, as has already been mentioned, but takes office whilst wildfires are continuing to rage across the west coast of the United States. At the end of the hottest year on record last year, speaking of which, I'm also overheating. And that Trump and wildfires moment challenges, I think, an implicit belief that a lot of us in the climate movement have had, very much me included, which is that the more that climate impacts start to bite, it will kind of organically follow that people and states will demand decarbonisation and progressive climate action. But in reality, the radical right has often been better at capitalising on the fear and the insecurity that climate impacts generate. Which brings me to the point raised by Yavor and Marika's report and this discussion that, like, in this conjuncture, the way in which we talk about climate insecurity is vital and can have, you know, interesting and unintended consequences. And, you know, I work with people who have spent years trying to get states to accept that climate change is a security threat. And the argument kind of makes sense, right? What could be a greater security threat than the potential rendering of human habitats uninhabitable? Shouldn't the security establishment take climate as seriously as they take the threat of war, if not more so? And isn't the language of security potentially a way to bridge the great gulf between progressives and conservatives on climate action? But as has already been discussed, we quickly run into some unintended consequences. And I remember quite a few climate campaigners being excited even when the Pentagon began to include climate change scenarios in their wargaming. But this didn't mean that one of the world's largest polluters, which remains exempt from global decarbonisation targets, suddenly became an ally of the climate cause. It meant that a certain section of people in the security establishment had begun to frame climate change in a new way, not as the crisis, not as a problem to be averted, but as a problem to win and to seek power from. And there's a big risk that, like, especially in a very difficult, very fracturing geopolitical moment, that what has been referred to by some scholars as militarized adaptation starts to take root, where we prioritize investing in things like weatherproofing the combat capabilities of armies, or engaging in contests to secure access to strategic resources as our priorities, rather than decarbonisation and inclusive and just adaptation. And over 6 decades on from Eisenhower's famous warning about the military-industrial complex, there are actors in the private sector already jockeying for position and seeking to push things in that direction. I've had the pleasure this week of spending some time in the minutes of the meetings from various defence contractors over the last few years. We have Raytheon in 2022 talking openly about the quote-unquote expanded business opportunities from climate insecurity. We have French company Thales in 2023 talking about the opportunities to, again, I quote, increase revenues from the physical impacts of climate change, and the list goes on and on. And we don't need to gaze too far into our crystal ball to see what that future looks like, because we're already some way down the rabbit hole in the migration space. In early 2024, just before the Munich Security Conference, the largest global gathering of the Global North security establishment, the conference organisers undertook a survey of 12,000 Europeans in which climate-linked migration was cited as the biggest threat to European security, even while 2 wars were raging on its borders. And about a few months before that, the UN Secretary-General Antonio Guterres had said that failure to tackle climate change would lead to a biblical exodus of migrants from their countries. And in the Secretary-General's very well-meaning bid to drum up support for climate action, I doubt he realised that probably wasn't what he was doing, and he was probably inadvertently doing far more to drum up support for an already expansive and expanding machine of border surveillance and militarization. Climate-linked migration won't, in fact, most likely see masses of people moving internationally, but it is very real, and it is already very much here. And just as one anecdote, I volunteer, as Mary said, in Civil Sea Rescue, which, is a very big example, very egregious example of the criminalization of NGOs and humanitarians. But if I get too far into that, I'll be here all night, and Yav or Mary or someone will come and shout at me. But last October, our ship, which incidentally was a former research vessel which had been looking into the effect of climate change on deep water ocean currents before becoming a rescue ship, was picked up a fisherman off the coast of Misrata in Libya. And, he is one of many people who would never have referred to himself as a climate migrant. Most people don't, but you get talking, and after a while, the stories come up about the fish catch getting smaller year on year, the summers getting longer and hotter, and how that plays into politics and how people behave. The UNHCR says now that I think 90% of the refugees they handle come from countries that are on the front lines of climate change. And there's a few interesting court cases in Britain recently where climate has been found a factor in people's asylum claims, and that's been upheld. But anyway, after rescuing this fisherman, we returned to the European side, to Sicily, which was already a poor region, and that summer had seen its forests burn up, had seen farmers forced to kill their livestock ahead of time and flee to the mainland. And those shortages, those scarcities, have created a situation in which the right were able to additionally weaponize the debate over migration, over pressures on Italy, and climate action suffered as a result. Whilst wildfires were blazing across Italy, Giorgia Meloni, the Prime Minister, held a conference to address what she calls the greatest threat facing the country. And it wasn't the wildfires, it was irregular migration. And we're seeing much the same in Trump's America now. And that kind of discourse has a huge impact on public policy, with resources having flooded into weapons and walls and surveillance across and beyond global north borders. And I've been tracking these for some time now in the course of research for the book. And it's extensive. I've seen AI-powered watchtowers in Mexico, drones flying over the Central Med, electric fences in Poland, armed patrol boats sent to the Libyan Coast Guard by the European Union and Italy to pull people back to detention camps in Libya where they're tortured, detention camps in Greece and Albania, and more. And all of this is mostly taking place in profoundly climate-affected regions. And a lot of the technologies, the powers, the states of exception, to reuse a term used earlier, that have already taken place have profound implications for wider civic space. There's a bill going through the Italian parliament at the moment which cites both climate protesters blocking public infrastructure and asylum seekers protesting against their conditions in detention as two groups for which new extraordinary powers are needed to tackle. And we're talking about bigger and more growing budgets as well. The global border and surveillance industry was worth 68 billion in 2019. It's probably well over double that now. And the absolute domination of migration control over a lot of Western political discourse has started to sap resources from climate action. In early 2024, again, the EU shifted a huge tranche of money from its Green Deal fund, which was at the time very ambitious, towards border surveillance and defence. And I doubt that's the last time we'll see such a budgetary shift happen. And, you know, that's kind of unsurprising when we're talking about Maloney and Trump, but it's happening with more liberal governments as well. The climate emergency, as we know, has no borders, but in many ways the response to it already has and does. And yes, of course, climate poses a real threat to all of our security, but unpacking what that actually means and who gets to interpret it is something that can have very, very different consequences. And I think to come back to a point that Poonam made in her bit just now, the climate challenge remains, as it has always been, a necessity and a historic opportunity to cooperate rather than to compete, to start to challenge the aspects of our current political and economic model that have created environmental and human risks in the first place, and to ensure that our response moves us toward and not further away from a thriving and just world that we can all live in. And I think forums like this can be a really critical place for these difficult conversations about what happens next. So thank you all for coming out, and I'll hand back to Mary.
Well, I think that was 4 really fascinating talks, and there's so much to say, but I'm going to hold myself back. And because I think we've now actually only got 15 minutes left for questions, and I want to really ask people online to put their questions to us. So what I'm going to do is to take, and I know there's one person in the audience I'm going to bring in, but I'm first going to take a couple of, I'll take one round of questions and then I'll go to Charlie Holt. So I'm going to take 2 people from the audience and 1 question Marika can tell us from online, if there is one. And I see the lady there who's been holding her hand up. So.
Yeah, thank you very much. It was very interesting. I can make it short. Basically, my question, I feel like you all have touched upon a bit. But what are the differences between democratic and authoritarian countries and how they respond, especially to shrinking civil space and using terrorist laws? Because we see it even in democratic countries, such as Germany, for example, using terrorist laws. So yeah, if you could say a bit more about that. Thank you.
Great. Anybody else from the floor who wants to ask a question? Yes, over here.
Thanks very much. I'm trying to channel optimism. I feel like we've had a set of very arresting presentations. And my question, thinking about particularly the militarization risk, is there a bit of a baddies problem for climate securitization versus war on terror and war on drugs? The logic here is that with the war on terror and war on drugs, the baddies are relatively powerless, relatively poor people, whereas in climate, the baddies are basically the rich and powerful, I mean us, ultimately. Does that prevent militarization from being as effective as a route or as a kind of pathway in securitization? And should that give us some optimism that maybe we can push things more towards the human security, the environmental peace-building side of securitization?
Thank you. And is there a question online?
There are not.
So there's no question online. So would Charlie Holt like to give his question? What? Yeah. Hello.
Hello. Thank you so much, and hello, and thank you very much for both the excellent report, which I read earlier today, and your very clear presentations and contributions to this debate. My name is Charlie. I lead the European work of an organisation called CLIDEF. We were set up 3 years ago in the face of escalating legal threats with the aim of emboldening climate defenders through the provision of legal support. And we've been mapping and monitoring these trends for a while now. I just wanted to follow up and ask a question about the points made about normalising securitized norms and practices. What I think is clear is that this process of normalisation is accelerated in the current climate of polarisation, and as a result, authoritarian trends are becoming more rapidly embedded in the legal and political system. And we've heard about Trump, and Trump is one example, but we're seeing many examples closer to home. I heard from Germany. I know we're expecting the first trial in the Last Generation investigations, which is investigating a climate organisation for allegedly forming a criminal organisation. But here in the UK, I mean, this is very timely because next week we have the cases of 16 climate activists who have been imprisoned for a total of 41 years being reviewed by the Court of Appeal. I think that's a good example of this. One of the perhaps most famous cases is that of Phoebe Plummer and Anna Holland, who threw Heinz tomato soup on a painting. And parallels are sometimes drawn with an act of suffragettes, one suffragette, Mary Richardson, who slashed a painting about 100 years ago. And I would say there are two key differences there. One, of course, was the fact that Mary Richardson slashed a painting with a meat cleaver multiple times. But in fact, the more important distinction separating the two is the fact that whereas Mary Richardson was imprisoned for 6 months, Anna and Phoebe have been imprisoned for, in one case, 2 years. And it really, I think, shows how rapidly these things are being normalised. And I just wanted to raise a question to that for the panel, because I think that this normalisation creates a tension with those who are who are taking into account the threats posed from prioritisation. I think it is understandable that climate defenders, in the face of this growing normalisation, will try to highlight the emergency we're living in, particularly when the threats which are being raised, militarisation and authoritarianism, are already on the rise. And I think we clearly need to be interrupting this current process of normalisation, as well as preempting other possible processes. So I guess that's where my question is. I think we need to be able to interrupt this process of normalisation that currently exists, and it seems that the best way we can do that is by starting to recognise the legitimacy of these protests themselves. And I think the question there, and I think rather the challenge there, is how we do that while at the same time anticipating and preparing ourselves from threats from broader securitization. But I'll stop there.
So I think, as we've only got 5 minutes left, we'll just go back to the panel, who can comment on the questions or on each other. And I will start at the other end. I mean, actually, I'll just, for ease, just start, do our physical order. So we'll start with Poonam, then Nathan, then Marika, and end with Yao.
Thank you. I'll just comment on the first question.
to give the rest of the panel opportunities for that. It's an interesting distinction between democracies and authoritarian governments, because some of the most problematic governments are democracies who've been targeting. This gets the nature of who's been elected, whether they're populist authoritarians as opposed to sort of pure autocrats. If you look through the kind of different categories of restrictions, I'd say media attacks are kind of widespread, both in authoritarian and democratic states. Michelle's Force report vividly sets out the way that mainstream media is complicit in creating a particular narrative about environmental activists. Surveillance takes place in both democratic, authoritarian states. Arrests, you would say, probably at a much larger scale in contexts like India, where you could have thousands of people being arrested under sedition legislation. Hong Kong, Belarus, you would kind of expect more likely that there'd be use of force used in some of those contexts, but you're seeing it used in democracies too. Fair trials, one would hope you're likely to get a fairer trial in a liberal democracy, but I think then when it came to sentencing, in the UK, sentences for climate activists has kind of set the bar for draconian sentences. I think the final bit I'll say is killings, and the kind of harshest restriction. Epicenter of that is Latin America, but particularly in countries like Colombia, which is ostensibly a democracy, not an authoritarian state. So we can kind of unpack that more, but it's a very mixed picture.
Thank you. Nathan.
Yeah, I'll just come back on that, your contribution, and thank you for bringing a note of optimism into it. And yeah, I think you're absolutely right. The problem for the kind of the subject of the climate emergency is not someone crossing a border, right? It's not someone protesting a pipeline being built through their backyard. It's the people, the organizations, the structures that are responsible for the, potentially most serious existential threat we've ever faced. But those forces will also go to great lengths to evade that responsibility. And so I guess what we're outlining here is the grand global political contest of the next decade and a half or more, right? How does this get interpreted? To whom do we assign responsibility, and what are the public policy implications of that? And yeah, hopefully we can be proven right on that. We'll see.
Thank you so much. And now I'll turn to Marie.
I'll just add a little bit on what Charlie, you were saying about the normalization of securitization practices and whether authoritarian trends, as I understood it, are embedded more and more across democracies as well. And I still think there's a difference, maybe a slimming difference that's growing over time between democracies and authoritarian responses. But we are starting to see a shift in democracies in the backgrounds, in using counterterrorism laws. Also, in the United States, you see quite a lot using counterterrorism laws to sort of squash protests and arrest activists. At the same time, I think, you had mentioned earlier, Poonam, that Colombia, for instance, it's a democracy, but it also has one of the highest rates of assassinations of environmental defenders, which may not necessarily can't draw a link to its democratic character, but also the nature of the conflict of very historically marginalized areas, whether these are also areas of Afro-Colombians and indigenous folks who are actually the protectors of the environment and guardians of biodiversity, while at the same time being the victims. And a lot of this has to do a lot more with, I think, also transnational corporations, the ways in which they come and the ways in which they merge as well with some of the political elites who are trying to extract resources. But I also think that there is a lot of thinking, and I was actually recently in the area in these regions, there's a lot more thinking recently on how do you sort of look at climate and security, but not climate securitization, climate security for those activists and the indigenous communities who are protecting the environment. So I think, I think there's like a lot of variation and different risks associated, no matter, within the range of democracies that exist.
Great. And the final word goes to Yap.
Well, I think I'll end on an optimistic note. And I think the optimism is partly a realization, as we were doing the research, all these different areas that we mapped. People worried about green sacrifice zones and what that means. People worried about how security will be defined. People worried about the use of technologies and the militarization of borders that converts the ecological threat into a human threat. And my sense is that there is a sort of a real ecosystem of actors, ideas, and practices that can offer an answer, that can push alternative frames, that can innovate, that can disrupt some of these very real risks, I think, of authoritarian and militarized responses, but that is premised also on developing alternatives. And when crises emerge, that's one of the big lessons of the war on terror. Crises are windows of opportunity, and there are constituencies of for securitization that will try to exploit these crises to push for their sort of militarized and authoritarian responses. But there is also, I think, a range of other actors who can prepare. So I think there is an opportunity to prevent, to disrupt, as well as to prevent, if we take it seriously.
Well, thank you. That was great. And somebody online asked if there